Good evening, and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness, where the clash of steel echoes across bloodied shores and the screams of the conquered pierce the northern winds. Tonight, we dive deep into the savage world of the Viking raiders, those legendary warriors who emerged from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to terrorize Europe for over 3 centuries. This is not just a tale of conquest and plunder, but a brutal chronicle of how a seafaring people transformed from farmers and traders into the most feared warriors the medieval world had ever seen. We will witness the birth of their age of terror, sail alongside their dragon-headed longships as they strike like lightning across undefended coastlines, and stand in the blood-soaked aftermath of battles that would echo through history. From the first horrific raid on Lindisfarne to the thunderous clashes at Stamford Bridge, we will uncover the raw, unfiltered truth behind the Viking legend, exploring their weapons of war, their ruthless tactics, and the legacy of fear they carved across the map of Europe. Before we set sail into these treacherous waters where history meets legend, we need to know where our fellow warriors are watching from tonight. Drop a comment below and tell us your location and the time as you watch this. Because just like the Vikings who struck when their enemies least expected it, whether at the break of dawn when the mist still clung to the water, or in the dead of night when only the moon witnessed their approach, your timing tells a story. Are you watching as the sun rises like a Viking preparing for a dawn raid? Or are you here in the darkness like a warrior planning under cover of night? And if you hunger for more untold stories of history's most brutal conflicts, the raw truth behind legendary battles, and the savage realities that shaped our world, then subscribe now. Because here, we do not just tell you about history, we drag you into its blood-soaked trenches and make you feel the weight of the axe and the burn of the flames. In the year 793 AD, as monks knelt in prayer on the windswept island of Lindisfarne, they had no way of knowing that their world was about to be shattered by forces beyond their comprehension. The Holy Island, as it was known, sat peacefully off the coast of Northumbria, its monastery a beacon of Christian learning and devotion in what the faithful considered a civilized corner of Dark Age Britain. For generations, these holy men had lived in relative peace, their greatest concerns centered around copying manuscripts and tending to the spiritual needs of the surrounding communities. But on that fateful June morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the North Sea mist, something emerged from the grey waters that would change the course of European history forever. Long, sleek shapes cut through the waves like predatory sharks, their dragon-headed prows rising and falling with the swell, their striped sails billowing in the dawn wind. These were not merchant vessels or fishing boats, but instruments of war, carrying within their wooden hulls a cargo of violence that would introduce medieval Europe to a new kind of terror. The Viking longships had arrived, and with them came men unlike any the Christian world had encountered. These were not the civilized warriors of organized kingdoms, fighting for clearly defined political goals. These were raiders from the north, pagans whose very existence seemed to mock the ordered world of Christian feudalism. They came not to conquer territory in the traditional sense, but to take what they wanted through sheer, overwhelming violence, and then disappear back into the mists from whence they came. As the dragon ships ground against the pebbled shore of Lindisfarne, armed figures leaped over the sides and onto the beach. The Vikings who stormed ashore that morning were a terrifying sight to behold. Many stood well over 6 feet tall, giants by medieval standards, their blonde or red hair braided with bones and iron rings, their bodies marked with intricate tattoos that told the stories of their lineage and battles. They wore mail shirts of iron links that clinked and rattled as they moved, and over these they draped thick woolen cloaks held fast with ornate bronze brooches. But it was their weapons that truly set them apart from other warriors of the age. Each Viking carried a collection of death-dealing tools that had been forged not just for war, but for the specific kind of brutal close-quarters combat that defined their way of fighting. The most iconic of these was the battle axe, a weapon that had evolved from the simple woodsman's tool into something far more sinister. These axes featured broad, curved blades that could split a skull with a single blow or shear through mail armor like cloth. The handles were often wrapped in leather for a secure grip, even when slick with blood, and many bore runic inscriptions that called upon the Norse gods for victory in battle. Alongside their axes, the Vikings carried swords that were masterpieces of Dark Age metallurgy. These were not crude iron bars beaten into shape by village smiths, but sophisticated weapons forged using techniques that had been refined over generations. The best Viking swords were pattern welded, created by twisting together rods of iron and steel to create blades that were both flexible and incredibly sharp. The hilts were often decorated with intricate silver inlays, and many bore names that spoke to their legendary qualities. A sword was not just a tool for a Viking warrior, it was a companion, an heirloom to be passed down through generations, and a symbol of the warrior's honor and prowess in battle. The shields carried by these northern warriors were equally sophisticated. Circular constructions of lime were bound with iron and painted in bold colors that served both practical and psychological purposes. The shield was not merely a defensive tool, but an active part of the Viking fighting style, used to bash enemies, deflect blows, and create openings for counterattacks. The iron boss at the center could crush bones, while the rim was often reinforced with metal strips that could split open an opponent's skull. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Viking warrior's arsenal was not any single weapon, but the complete absence of fear that seemed to radiate from these men as they prepared for battle. This was partly due to their religious beliefs, which promised that those who died bravely in combat would be taken to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. Death in battle was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as the ultimate honor. This belief system created warriors who fought with a reckless abandon that their enemies found impossible to match or understand. As the Vikings spread out across the beach at Lindisfarne, they moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. There was no hesitation, no pause for negotiation or diplomacy. They had come for one purpose only: to take everything of value and kill anyone who stood in their way. The monastery, with its accumulated wealth of gold and silver religious artifacts, its stores of grain and livestock, and its population of defenseless monks, was exactly the kind of target the Viking raiders sought. The attack began with a war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient monastery. It was not the organized battle cry of a disciplined army, but something more primal and terrifying, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of pagan darkness itself. The Vikings charged up the beach and through the monasteries, simple defenses like a force of nature, unstoppable and utterly without mercy. The monks who tried to flee were cut down where they ran. Those who stood their ground in an attempt to protect their holy treasures were slaughtered without hesitation. The Vikings showed no respect for the Christian symbols that filled the monastery, tearing down crosses, smashing altars, and using priceless illuminated manuscripts as kindling for their fires. This was not just robbery, but a deliberate act of cultural destruction that announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare. But the Vikings were not mindless berserkers, despite the terror they inspired. Their attack on Lindisfarne demonstrated a level of planning and intelligence that their enemies consistently underestimated. They had chosen their target carefully, studying the monastery's defenses, learning its routines, and timing their arrival to coincide with the moment when resistance would be minimal. They knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it, suggesting that their raid was based on detailed intelligence gathered over months or even years of preparation. The longships that had brought them to Lindisfarne were themselves marvels of naval engineering that gave the Cape Vikings capabilities that no other force of the age could match. These vessels were shallow-drafted, allowing them to navigate rivers and coastal waters that larger ships could not reach. They could be beached directly on shores, eliminating the need for harbors or docking facilities. Most importantly, they were fast, capable of outrunning any pursuit and appearing suddenly in locations where no attack was expected. The design of the longship was the result of centuries of evolution in Scandinavian shipbuilding, refined by generations of craftsmen who understood that survival in the harsh northern seas required vessels that combined speed, seaworthiness, and versatility. The ships were clinker-built, with overlapping planks that created a flexible hull capable of riding out even the most violent storms. The shallow keel allowed them to be pulled up onto beaches for repairs or winter storage, while the symmetrical design meant they could be rowed in either direction without having to turn around. But it was not just the ships themselves that made the Vikings such formidable seaborne raiders. It was their mastery of navigation techniques that allowed them to cross vast expanses of open ocean with deadly accuracy. Viking navigators could read the patterns of waves and currents, interpret the behavior of seabirds, and use the position of the sun and stars to plot courses across waters that other sailors feared to enter. They developed techniques for dead reckoning that allowed them to maintain their bearings even in fog or storms. And they created detailed mental maps of coastlines that they passed down through generations of oral tradition. The success of the Lindisfarne raid sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world, not just because of the violence and destruction it represented, but because it demonstrated that nowhere was truly safe from Viking attack. If a monastery on a fortified island could be taken so easily, what hope did undefended villages and towns have against these northern raiders? The psychological impact of the raid was perhaps even more significant than its immediate material consequences, marking the beginning of what historians now call the Viking Age, a period of over 2 centuries during which Scandinavian raiders would terrorize the coasts of Europe from Ireland to Constantinople. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident, but the opening move in a campaign of terror that would spread across the known world. In the years that followed, Viking longships appeared with increasing frequency off the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms, striking without warning and vanishing before effective resistance could be organized. These early raids established the pattern that would define Viking warfare for generations. Small groups of heavily armed warriors using superior mobility and the element of surprise to overwhelm static defenses and extract maximum profit from minimum risk. The Vikings who carried out these raids were not a unified nation or organized army in the conventional sense, but rather loose confederations of warriors, sailors, and adventurers bound together by shared culture, similar goals, and the promise of wealth and glory. They came from the kingdoms and chieftaincies of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, regions where the harsh climate and limited agricultural land created a surplus of young men eager to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The social structure of Scandinavian society, with its emphasis on personal honor, loyalty to kinship groups, and the warrior's code, provided both the motivation and the organizational framework for the raids. The success of Viking raids did not come from superior numbers or advanced technology alone, but from a revolutionary approach to warfare that combined mobility, surprise, and psychological terror into a devastatingly effective strategy. Unlike the armies of established kingdoms, which moved slowly and required extensive supply lines, Viking raiders operated more like special forces units, striking hard and fast before disappearing into the vastness of the sea. The typical Viking raid began long before the dragon ships appeared on the horizon. Intelligence gathering was a crucial first phase, carried out by traders, merchants, and sometimes monks or pilgrims who could move freely through Christian lands without arousing suspicion. These scouts would identify potential targets, studying their defenses, cataloging their wealth, and noting the patterns of daily life that might provide opportunities for successful attack. The ideal target from a Viking perspective was a monastery, church, or trading settlement that combined significant portable wealth with minimal military defenses. Monasteries were particularly attractive because they served as repositories for donations from wealthy patrons, accumulating gold, silver, and precious gems over many years. They were also typically located near water for transportation purposes, making them accessible to longship attack. And they were populated by monks who had taken vows of non-violence and were therefore unlikely to offer effective resistance. Once a target had been selected, the raiders would plan their approach with meticulous care. They studied tidal patterns, seasonal weather conditions, and local customs to determine the optimal time for attack. Dawn raids were particularly favored because they caught defenders at their most vulnerable. While the half-light made it difficult to gauge the size and strength of the attacking force, the psychological impact of emerging from the morning mist like supernatural beings was an added advantage that the Vikings were quick to exploit. The longships would approach their target using a combination of sail and/or power, with the timing calculated to arrive just as conditions were most favorable for attack. The ships would beach simultaneously at multiple points, if possible, to divide the defenders' attention and prevent organized resistance. The Vikings would leap ashore with weapons already drawn, their war cries designed not just to coordinate the attack but to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. The weapons and armor carried by Viking raiders were specifically chosen for the kind of fighting they expected to encounter. The battle axe, in particular, was perfectly suited to Viking tactics because it could function both as a weapon and as a tool for breaking down doors, smashing locks, and demolishing defensive positions. The curved blade could hook shields and pull defenders off balance, while the weight of the axe head delivered crushing blows that could penetrate armor and shields alike. Viking swords, while expensive and therefore not carried by every warrior, represented the pinnacle of Dark Age weaponsmithing. The best examples were forged using techniques that would not be matched elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The process began with the creation of pattern-welded cores, made by twisting together rods of different types of steel to create a flexible spine that would not break under stress. This core was then covered with harder steel edges that could be honed to a razor sharpness. The resulting blade combined flexibility with cutting power in a way that made it superior to most other weapons of the period. The spear was perhaps the most common weapon in the Viking arsenal, carried by virtually every warrior, regardless of his wealth or status. Viking spears were not the simple pointed sticks that might be imagined, but sophisticated weapons with carefully designed heads that served multiple functions. The broad-bladed spear could slash as well as thrust, while the winged spear incorporated crossguards that prevented an enemy from sliding up the shaft after being impaled. The long reach of the spear made it ideal for fighting from the deck of a ship or for keeping armored opponents at a distance. The shields carried by Viking warriors were works of art as well as instruments of war, made from carefully selected wood and reinforced with iron. They were painted in bold designs that served to identify different groups of warriors and to intimidate enemies. The shield was an active part of Viking fighting technique, used not just for defense, but for offense as well. A skilled warrior could use the metal rim of his shield to deliver crushing blows, while the iron boss at the center could punch through mail armor or break bones. But perhaps the most terrifying weapon in the Viking arsenal was the psychological impact of their reputation. By the middle of the 9th century, the mere sight of dragon-headed ships on the horizon was enough to send entire populations fleeing in panic. The Vikings had deliberately cultivated this reputation for savagery and unpredictability, understanding that fear was often more effective than actual violence in achieving their goals. The berserkers represented the extreme end of this psychological warfare. These were warriors who fought in a trance-like state that made them seemingly impervious to pain and utterly without fear. Whether this state was induced by drugs, religious fervor, or simple battle madness, the effect on enemies was profound. Berserkers would charge into battle wearing only animal skins, howling like wolves or bears, and fighting with such ferocity that they seemed more like supernatural beings than mortal men. The tactical employment of berserkers in Viking raids was typically as shock troops, sent in first to break the enemy's will to resist, and create openings that could be exploited by the more conventionally equipped warriors who followed. The mere presence of berserkers in a raiding party was often enough to convince defenders that resistance was futile, leading to surrender or flight before serious fighting even began. The organization of a typical Viking raid reflected the social structure of Scandinavian society, with clear hierarchies based on wealth, fighting ability, and reputation. The raid leader, often called a jarl or sea king, was typically a man of significant personal wealth who could afford to outfit a longship and recruit a crew. Below him were the hussar, experienced warriors who served as lieutenants and ship captains, responsible for maintaining discipline and executing the leader's commands. The bulk of the raiding force consisted of carl, free farmers and craftsmen who joined raids to supplement their income and gain reputation as warriors. The profits from successful raids were divided according to strict codes that took into account each participant's contribution to the expedition. The raid leader typically received the largest share, followed by the ship owners and experienced warriors. Even the humblest member of the crew, however, could expect to return home with more wealth than he could earn in years of farming or craft work, providing a powerful incentive for young men to join raiding expeditions. The impact of Viking raids extended far beyond their immediate victims, reshaping the political, economic, and social structures of medieval Europe in ways that would persist for centuries. The constant threat of raid forced coastal communities to relocate inland, abandon lucrative trade routes, or invest heavily in fortifications that drained resources from other activities. The unpredictability of Viking attacks made long-term planning virtually impossible for many communities, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that inhibited economic development and political stability. Monasteries and churches, the primary repositories of learning and culture in medieval Europe, were particularly hard hit by Viking raids. Countless manuscripts, works of art, and religious artifacts were destroyed or carried off, representing an incalculable loss to human civilization. The monks who survived Viking attacks often moved their communities inland, taking with them the knowledge and skills that had made monasteries centers of learning and technological innovation. The political impact of Viking raids was equally significant, as rulers throughout Europe were forced to divert resources from other priorities to defend against the northern threat. This often meant higher taxes, forced military service, and the construction of expensive fortifications that provided only partial protection against such mobile enemies. Some rulers attempted to buy off the Vikings with tribute payments, a strategy that sometimes provided temporary relief but also encouraged further raids by demonstrating the profitability of the enterprise. As the 9th century progressed, the nature of Viking activity in Europe began to change in ways that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the continent. What had begun as small-scale raids by individual ship crews gradually evolved into large-scale invasions involving hundreds of vessels and thousands of warriors. These great armies, as they came to be known, represented a new phase of Viking expansion that went beyond simple raiding to encompass conquest, settlement, and the establishment of permanent Viking kingdoms on foreign soil. The transformation from raider to conqueror was driven by several factors that converged in the mid-9th century. The success of earlier raids had demonstrated the wealth and vulnerability of European targets, attracting increasing numbers of Scandinavian warriors to join expeditions. At the same time, political changes within Scandinavia itself were creating pressures that encouraged emigration. As emerging kings consolidated power and displaced rival nobles who were forced to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The first of the great armies assembled in Denmark around 865 AD, under the leadership of legendary figures whose names would echo through history. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ragnarsson, and Uber were said to be the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a semi-legendary Viking chieftain whose death in the snake pit of King Glau of Northumbria had supposedly triggered a great war of revenge against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. Whether or not the story of Ragnar's death was true, the great army that crossed to England in 865 was a force unlike anything the island had ever faced. Contemporary chronicles describe a fleet of several hundred ships, carrying an army estimated at between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, a massive force by the standards of the age. These were not raiders looking for quick profit, but conquerors seeking to carve out permanent kingdoms in the rich agricultural lands of England. The arrival of the great army marked the beginning of a 15-year campaign that would bring 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to their knees and establish Viking control over more than half of England. The tactics employed by the invaders demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of medieval warfare that went far beyond the hit-and-run raids that had characterized earlier Viking activity. The great army moved with a combination of speed and strategic planning that consistently wrong-footed their enemies. They would establish fortified bases, often on islands or in easily defended positions, from which they could launch attacks in multiple directions. These bases served not just as military strongholds, but as administrative centers for the territories they conquered, complete with workshops for repairing weapons and equipment, storage facilities for plunder and supplies, and accommodation for the growing number of settlers who followed in the wake of conquest. The Siege of York in 866 demonstrated the evolution of Viking military capabilities in dramatic fashion. The city was one of the most important in northern England, a center of trade, religion, and political power that had been fortified by the Romans centuries earlier and strengthened by successive Anglo-Saxon rulers. The walls of York presented a formidable obstacle to any attacker, rising 20 feet above the ground and protected by deep ditches that made direct assault extremely dangerous. The Vikings, however, had learned much about siege warfare from their raids on Frankish territories, where they had encountered heavily fortified cities and developed techniques for overcoming static defenses. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault, they established a complete blockade around York, cutting off all supplies and communication with the outside world. They constructed their own fortified camps around the city, creating a ring of Viking strongholds that made it impossible for relief forces to reach the besieged defenders. The psychological warfare that had always been a hallmark of Viking tactics was employed to devastating effect during the siege. The raiders made no attempt to hide their presence or activities, instead deliberately creating as much noise and spectacle as possible. They lit huge bonfires at night that could be seen for miles, held elaborate feasts within sight of the starving defenders, and conducted mock battles that demonstrated their numbers and fighting prowess. The message was clear: resistance was futile, and surrender was the only rational option. When York finally fell after several months of siege, the Vikings demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that would characterize their later rule. Rather than simply sacking the city and moving on, they established a permanent base there, installing their own administrators and beginning the process of integrating the surrounding territory into a Viking kingdom. They retained many of the existing administrative structures, recognizing that efficient governance required local knowledge and expertise, but they placed their own people in key positions of authority. The conquest of York was followed by a series of campaigns that systematically dismantled the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings showed a remarkable ability to adapt their tactics to different types of terrain and defensive positions, employing everything from naval assaults on coastal fortifications to complex maneuvers designed to divide enemy armies and defeat them in detail. At the Battle of Edington in 871, the great army faced its most serious challenge when it encountered the forces of Alfred, the young King of Wessex, who would later be known as Alfred the Great. The battle was fought in the rolling hills of Wiltshire, terrain that favored the Saxon shield wall over the more fluid Viking fighting style. For once, the Vikings found themselves facing an enemy who was prepared for their tactics and willing to meet them in open battle on relatively equal terms. The fighting at Edington was brutal, even by the standards of the age, with both sides employing the full range of Dark Age weaponry in close quarters combat that left hundreds of warriors dead on the field. The Vikings, accustomed to facing enemies who broke and ran when faced with their ferocious charges, found themselves grinding against a Saxon shield wall that refused to yield ground. The battle swayed back and forth for hours, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. The turning point came when Alfred personally led a cavalry charge against the Viking flank, a move that caught the raiders off guard and created the opening the Saxons needed to break the Viking line. For the first time in their English campaign, the great army found itself in full retreat, leaving behind their baggage train and many of their wounded companions. The defeat at Edington marked the beginning of the end for the great army as a unified force, but it also demonstrated the adaptability that had made the Vikings such successful conquerors. Rather than continuing a hopeless war against a resurgent Wessex, the Viking leaders entered into negotiations with Alfred that resulted in the Treaty of Wedmore, an agreement that formally recognized Viking control over much of northern and eastern England in return for their conversion to Christianity and acknowledgement of Alfred's authority over the remaining Saxon territories. The establishment of the Danelaw, as the Viking-controlled territories came to be known, represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Viking activity in Western Europe. These were no longer raiders passing through, but permanent settlers who intended to make their homes in the lands they had conquered. The process of settlement brought with it profound changes in the social, economic, and cultural life of the affected regions. The Vikings who settled in the Danelaw brought with them advanced agricultural techniques, sophisticated craftsmanship, and extensive trade networks that connected England to markets throughout the Baltic and beyond. Viking merchants established trading posts in cities like York and Lincoln that became centers of international commerce, dealing in everything from amber and furs from the north to silk and spices from the Mediterranean and Middle East. The legal system that emerged in the Danelaw reflected a fusion of Viking and Anglo-Saxon traditions that would influence English law for centuries to come. Viking concepts of personal freedom, property rights, and judicial procedure were blended with existing Saxon practices to create a hybrid system that was both more democratic and more flexible than the purely feudal arrangements that characterized most of medieval Europe. The linguistic impact of Viking settlement was equally profound, with thousands of Scandinavian words entering the English language and fundamentally altering its structure and vocabulary. Common English words like sky, egg, knife, husband, and they are all derived from Old Norse, reflecting the deep integration of Viking settlers into English society. Even more significantly, the Viking influence helped to simplify English grammar, eliminating many of the complex inflections that had characterized Old English and creating the foundation for the more flexible language structure that would eventually produce modern English. In the year 885 AD, as the last leaves of autumn fell from the trees along the Seine, a sight appeared that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Stretching as far as the eye could see along the river, an armada of Viking longships advanced toward the heart of the Frankish Empire. This was not a mere raiding party, but a great army that numbered in the tens of thousands, led by men whose names had already become legends throughout Scandinavia and whose ambition reached far beyond simple plunder. The target of this massive expedition was Paris, the jewel of the Frankish kingdom and one of the most heavily fortified cities in Western Europe. Protected by massive stone walls, defended by well-trained soldiers, and situated on an island in the Seine that made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault. Paris represented everything that Viking raiders had learned to respect and fear in their campaigns against the organized kingdoms of Europe. But the Vikings who approached Paris in that autumn of 885 were no longer the wild raiders who had struck Lindisfarne nearly a century before. These were experienced conquerors who had learned the arts of siege, warfare through decades of campaigning against the finest fortifications that Europe could offer. They had evolved from pirates to warriors to something approaching a professional army, complete with engineers, siege specialists, and a supply train that could sustain a prolonged campaign. The leader of this great army was Sigfred, a Viking chieftain whose reputation for cunning and ruthlessness had made him one of the most feared men in Europe. Alongside him sailed Rollo, the giant Norseman who would later become the first Duke of Normandy, and dozens of other jarls and sea kings, each commanding his own ships and warriors, but united in the common goal of taking the greatest prize that the Frankish Empire could offer. The sight that greeted the defenders of Paris as they looked out from their walls that morning must have been one of the most terrifying in medieval history. The Viking fleet stretched for miles along the Seine, a forest of masts and dragon-headed prows that seemed to cover the entire river. Contemporary chronicles speak of 700 ships, though this number may be exaggerated by frightened scribes. Even if the true figure was half that, it still represented the largest Viking expedition ever assembled, a force capable of taking on entire kingdoms. The ships themselves told the story of Viking evolution from raiders to conquerors, while the traditional longships were still present. They were now accompanied by larger vessels designed specifically for siege warfare. Some carried prefabricated siege towers that could be assembled on shore, while others had been converted into floating platforms for catapults and other artillery. The Vikings had clearly learned much from their encounters with Frankish military engineers, and were now turning this knowledge against their former teachers. As the fleet drew closer to Paris, the defenders could see that this was not merely a military expedition, but something approaching a migration. Among the warriors were women and children, craftsmen and merchants, all the apparatus of a people on the move. The Vikings had not come simply to raid and retreat, but to conquer and settle, to carve out a permanent kingdom in the heart of Europe. The first challenge facing the Vikings was the fortified bridges that connected the island city to both banks of the Seine. These were not simple wooden structures, but massive stone constructions that had been built specifically to prevent hostile fleets from advancing up the river toward the heart of the Frankish kingdom. The bridges were defended by heavily armed garrisons and protected by towers that commanded the approaches from both water and land. The assault on the bridges began at dawn on November 26, 885, with a complexity and coordination that demonstrated how far Viking military thinking had advanced. While one group of warriors attacked the bridge towers directly, using ladders and grappling hooks to scale the walls, Others attempted to undermine the foundations using techniques learned from Frankish engineers. Still others launched a coordinated attack on the city walls themselves, forcing the defenders to divide their attention and resources. The fighting that followed was some of the most intense of the entire Viking Age, a brutal contest between the most advanced siege techniques of the period and some of the strongest fortifications in Europe. The Vikings brought to bear every weapon and tactic they had learned in decades of warfare, from fire arrows that sought to ignite the wooden portions of the defenses to massive battering rams that pounded against the stone walls with thunderous impacts that could be heard for miles. The defenders of Paris, led by Count Odo and Bishop Jocelyn, proved themselves worthy opponents, employing every trick of defensive warfare to hold back the Viking assault. They poured boiling oil on attackers who tried to scale the walls, dropped huge stones on the siege engines, and launched sorties designed to destroy Viking equipment and disrupt their attack formations. But it was not just the physical defenses of Paris that made it such a formidable opponent. The city was a symbol of Frankish resistance to Viking expansion, a place where the Christian kingdoms of Europe had decided to make their stand against the pagan invaders from the north. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that the fate of their entire civilization might hang in the balance. The siege of Paris became a test of wills as much as a military contest, with both sides demonstrating the kind of stubborn determination that had made them formidable opponents. The Vikings, despite their failure to take the city by storm, settled in for a prolonged siege, building fortified camps on both sides of the river and establishing a blockade that cut off all supplies to the defenders. The winter of 885 to 886 was one of the harshest in living memory, with temperatures dropping far below normal and snow falling so heavily that it was difficult to move supplies or reinforce positions. Both attackers and defenders suffered terribly from the cold, disease, and malnutrition, but neither side showed any inclination to abandon the struggle. The Vikings had staked their reputation on taking Paris, while the Franks understood that failure to hold the city would open the entire kingdom to Viking conquest. As the siege dragged on through the winter months, it became clear that the Vikings had developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining their forces in the field for extended periods. They established workshops for repairing weapons and equipment, organized foraging parties that ranged far into the countryside in search of supplies, and even began minting their own coins using silver looted from churches and monasteries. The psychological warfare that had always been a hallmark of Viking tactics was employed to devastating effect during the siege. The raiders made sure that the defenders could see and hear everything that was happening in their camps. From the elaborate feasts that celebrated successful foraging expeditions to the ritual sacrifices that were offered to the Norse gods for victory in battle. The sound of Viking war songs echoing across the water at night was designed to remind the besieged Christians that they faced enemies who welcomed death and feared nothing that mortal men could do to them. The breakthrough came in February of 886, when Viking engineers finally succeeded in undermining one of the bridge towers. The collapse of the tower created a gap in the defenses that allowed Viking ships to pass through for the first time, opening up new avenues of attack and forcing the defenders to stretch their already thin resources even further. But even this success was not enough to bring about the immediate fall of Paris. The city's defenses were too strong and its defenders too determined to be overcome by a single breakthrough. The siege continued through the spring and into the summer of 886, becoming one of the longest sustained military operations of the entire medieval period. The resolution of the siege came not through military victory but through political negotiation. As Emperor Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief army and entered into discussions with the Viking leaders, The resulting agreement allowed the Vikings to withdraw with a massive tribute payment and permission to continue up the Seine to raid other parts of the Frankish kingdom. While this was technically a victory for the defenders, who had held their city against overwhelming odds, it was also a demonstration of Viking power that sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The siege of Paris marked a turning point in the relationship between the Vikings and the established powers of medieval Europe. It demonstrated that the Northmen had evolved from simple raiders into a force capable of challenging the greatest fortifications and most powerful armies that Christian Europe could field. More importantly, it showed that they were willing to commit massive resources to achieving their goals, transforming warfare from a seasonal activity into a year-round profession. The aftermath of the siege saw significant changes in both Viking and Frankish military thinking. The Franks began construction of new fortifications along the Seine and other major rivers, while also developing new tactics specifically designed to counter Viking mobility and surprise. The Vikings, for their part, learned valuable lessons about the limitations of siege warfare and began to focus more on political solutions that could achieve their goals without the massive costs associated with prolonged military campaigns. The reputation of Viking warriors as the most feared fighters of their age was not built on mythology alone, but on a deadly combination of superior weapons, innovative tactics, and a warrior culture that glorified death in battle above all other achievements. To understand the terror that Viking raiders inspired throughout medieval Europe, we must examine not just their weapons and tactics, but the entire philosophy of warfare that made them such devastating opponents. At the heart of Viking military culture was the concept of the berserker, warriors who fought in a trance-like state that made them seemingly impervious to pain and utterly fearless in the face of death. The word itself comes from bearshirt, referring to the animal pelts that these warriors wore into battle instead of conventional armor. But berserkers were more than just wild men driven by battle fury. They were the product of a sophisticated warrior tradition that combined religious ritual, psychological preparation, and combat training into something that their enemies found both incomprehensible and terrifying. The transformation into berserker rage was not a spontaneous occurrence, but the result of careful preparation that could take hours or even days. The process began with ritual purification, often involving fasting, meditation, and the consumption of various herbs and fungi that were believed to open the warrior's mind to the influence of the gods. Sacred weapons would be blessed by priests of Odin, while the warriors themselves would often carve runic inscriptions into their bodies, calling upon the Allfather to grant them victory or a glorious death. As the moment of battle approached, the berserkers would begin their war dance, a frenzied ritual that combined elements of religious ceremony with practical combat preparation. They would howl like wolves, bite their shields, and foam at the mouth, working themselves into a state of ecstatic fury that contemporary observers described as supernatural in its intensity. When they finally charged into battle, they seemed to be creatures from another world, immune to weapons and utterly without fear of death or injury. The psychological impact of berserkers on enemy formations cannot be overstated. Medieval warfare depended heavily on maintaining disciplined formations and coordinated movements, but the sight of apparently inhuman warriors charging without regard for their own safety had a devastating effect on enemy morale. Soldiers who might have stood firm against a conventional attack would break and run when faced with berserkers, creating gaps in the line that could be exploited by the more conventionally equipped warriors who followed behind. But berserkers were only the most extreme expression of a warrior culture that permeated all levels of Viking society. Every free man was expected to be capable of defending himself and his family, and most carried weapons as a matter of course. The social status of a Viking was directly related to his reputation as a warrior. with the greatest honors reserved for those who had proven themselves in battle against worthy opponents. This warrior culture was supported by a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and weapon making that produced some of the finest arms and armor of the medieval period. Viking smiths were masters of their craft, capable of creating weapons that were both beautiful and deadly. The process of forging a sword could take months, with the smith carefully selecting and preparing different types of iron and steel to create a blade that combined flexibility with hardness in exactly the right proportions. The most prized Viking swords were pattern welded, created by twisting together rods of different metals to create distinctive patterns in the blade that were both functional and decorative. These patterns were not merely ornamental, but served a practical purpose by indicating the quality and composition of the steel. A skilled warrior could look at the pattern on a sword blade and determine its likely performance in battle. Information that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. The hilts of Viking swords were often works of art in their own right, decorated with intricate silver or gold inlays that depicted scenes from Norse mythology or celebrated the achievements of previous owners. Many swords had names that reflected their legendary qualities or their history of victory in battle. Names like Gram Fierce, Bringhubiter, Imel, and Gunlogi Flame of Battle were not just poetic flourishes, but genuine attempts to capture the spiritual essence of weapons that were considered to have their own personalities and powers. The spear was perhaps an even more important weapon in the Viking arsenal than the sword, carried by virtually every warrior regardless of his wealth or status. Viking spears came in a variety of forms, from light javelins designed for throwing two heavy thrusting weapons intended for close combat. The heads of these spears were forged with the same care and skill that went into sword making, often featuring complex shapes that served multiple functions. The broad-bladed spear was designed to function almost like a sword on a long handle, capable of slashing as well as thrusting. The winged spear incorporated crossguards that prevented an impaled enemy from sliding up the shaft to strike at the spear wielder, while also making it easier to withdraw the weapon from a body or shield. Some spearheads were barbed, designed to catch in armor or shields and disarm opponents, while others featured hooks or cutting edges that could be used to trip horses or pull riders from their mounts. The battle axe was perhaps the most iconic Viking weapon, evolving from the simple woodsman's tool into something far more sophisticated and deadly. The heads of battle axes were carefully shaped to optimize their cutting power while minimizing their weight, allowing warriors to wield them with devastating speed and precision. The curved blade could hook shields and pull them aside, creating openings for follow-up attacks, while the weight of the axe head delivered crushing blows that could penetrate even the best armor of the period. The handles of battle axes were typically made from carefully selected hardwood, often ash or oak, and were wrapped with leather or rawhide to provide a secure grip even when slick with blood and sweat. The length of the handle was calculated to give the warrior maximum leverage, while still allowing the weapon to be used effectively in the confined spaces of ship chews, ship combat, or siege warfare. Viking shields were more than just defensive equipment. They were an integral part of the warrior's fighting system. Made from carefully selected wood and reinforced with iron, they were designed to be both lightweight and strong, capable of turning aside the heaviest blows while still allowing the warrior to maneuver quickly. The circular shape distributed the force of impacts over a wide area, while the iron boss at the center could be used as an offensive weapon to punch through enemy armor or break bones. The shields were painted in bold colors and patterns that served both practical and psychological purposes. The designs helped warriors identify friend from foe in the chaos of battle, while also serving to intimidate enemies and boost the morale of allies. Some shields bore the personal symbols of their owners, while others displayed the emblems of the warband or clan to which the warrior belonged. The defensive capabilities of Viking warriors extended beyond their shields to include sophisticated armor that was both effective and expensive. The mail shirt, or byrnie, was the standard protection for wealthy warriors, consisting of thousands of interlinked iron rings that could turn aside sword cuts and spear thrusts. The process of making mail was incredibly time-consuming, with each ring having to be individually forged, shaped, and linked to its neighbors. A single mail shirt could take a skilled craftsman months to complete, making it one of the most valuable possessions a warrior could own. Helmets were equally important for protection. Though the popular image of Vikings wearing horned helmets is largely mythical, real Viking helmets were practical affairs, designed to protect the head while allowing maximum visibility and freedom of movement. They typically featured a conical or rounded shape that deflected blows rather than absorbing them directly, with a nose guard that protected the face without restricting vision. The tactics employed by Viking warriors were as sophisticated as their equipment, combining individual skill with coordinated group movements that maximized their effectiveness on the battlefield. The basic formation was the shield wall, a line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping to create an almost impenetrable barrier. From behind this wall, spears could be thrust at enemies, while the front rank could hack at opponents with swords and axes. But Vikings were not content to simply stand in place and trade blows with their enemies. They developed a variety of tactical movements designed to break enemy formations and create opportunities for decisive attack. The Svinfylking or boar's head was a wedge formation that concentrated the best warriors at the front, allowing them to punch through enemy lines like a spear point. The Skjaldborg or shield fortress was a defensive formation that could be adopted when under heavy attack, with the warriors forming a circle or square with their shields facing outward. Perhaps the most terrifying Viking tactic was the Berserksganga, the berserker charge that combined religious fervor with tactical surprise to devastating effect. The berserkers would position themselves at the front of the formation, working themselves into their battle trance, while the more conventional warriors prepared to exploit whatever openings they created. When the charge began, the berserkers would sprint toward the enemy line, seemingly oblivious to the missiles being thrown at them, and hurl themselves against the enemy's shields with such force that they often succeeded in breaking through even well-disciplined formations. The psychological impact of Viking warfare extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The reputation for savagery and unpredictability that Vikings cultivated made them feared throughout Europe, often achieving their goals through the threat of violence rather than actual fighting. The mere sight of dragon-headed ships on the horizon was enough to send entire populations fleeing in panic, allowing small groups of raiders to control large areas with minimal resistance. This reputation was carefully maintained through deliberate acts of spectacular violence that were designed as much from their psychological impact as their immediate military effect. The Blood Eagle, a ritual execution in which the victim's ribs were cut away from the spine and the lungs pulled out to resemble wings, was one such practice that was intended to terrorize enemies and demonstrate the fate that awaited those who opposed the Vikings. The religious dimension of Viking warfare was equally important in understanding their effectiveness as fighters. The Norse pantheon was dominated by warrior gods like Odin and Thor, who were believed to actively participate in human battles and reward brave warriors with a place in Valhalla. This belief system created warriors who genuinely welcomed death in battle, seeing it not as a defeat but as the ultimate victory that would secure their place among the Inherja, the chosen slain who would fight alongside the gods at Ragnarok. The cult of Odin was particularly important in Viking military culture, as the Allfather was seen as the patron of warriors and the giver of victory in battle. Warriors would dedicate their weapons to Odin before battle, carve his symbol into their shields, and offer him sacrifices of captured enemies. The belief that Odin personally chose which warriors would die in battle gave Vikings a fatalistic attitude that made them incredibly dangerous opponents, willing to take risks that more conventional warriors would never contemplate. The morning of September 25th, 1066, dawned clear and unusually warm for the season in the rolling countryside of Yorkshire, where the river Derwent meandered through peaceful meadows that had known little violence since the Danish wars of the previous century. But on this day, destiny had chosen this quiet corner of England as the stage for what would prove to be the final act of the Viking Age, a battle that would determine not only the fate of kingdoms, but the future of medieval Europe itself. Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking kings, stood on the banks of the Derwent, surveying his army with the practiced eye of a warrior who had spent more than 3 decades fighting from the frozen wastes of Russia to the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean. At 6.5 feet tall, he towered over most of his contemporaries, a giant of a man whose mere presence on a battlefield was enough to inspire his followers and strike fear into his enemies. His iron-grey hair and beard bore the scars of countless battles, while his pale blue eyes held the cold fire of a man who had looked upon death so many times that it had become an old acquaintance. The army that Hardrada had brought to England was a gathering of the finest warriors that the North could produce, men who had answered his call to arms not for gold or land alone, but for the chance to serve under the greatest Viking leader of the age. There were Norwegians from the fjords and mountains, Danes from the windswept coasts of Jutland, Swedes from the forests around Uppsala, and even Russ from the great rivers of Eastern Europe. Each contingent brought its own traditions, its own weapons, and its own reasons for following Hardrada on what many suspected would be his greatest and final campaign. The weapons carried by Hardrada's army represented the pinnacle of Viking military technology, refined through centuries of warfare and enhanced by techniques learned during campaigns that had taken Nordic warriors to the very edge of the known world. The king himself carried a massive, 2-handed sword that bore the name Fotbitter, or Legbitter, a weapon so long that it could cleave a man from shoulder to hip with a single stroke. The blade had been forged by the finest smiths of Constantinople using steel that had originated in the distant lands of Woots, then transported along the trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. Hardrada's mail shirt was a masterpiece of the armorer's art, consisting of more than 30,000 individually forged rings linked together in patterns that had been perfected over generations of warfare. The metal had been treated with techniques learned from Byzantine craftsmen, giving it a blue-black sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Over this, he wore a cloak of deep blue silk, embroidered with golden thread in patterns that told the story of his victories from Stickelstad to Stamford Bridge. The army's formation reflected the social structure of Scandinavian society, with the king's household warriors forming the core of the battle line, while contingents from different regions and clans took their positions according to ancient custom and the reputation of their leaders. At the center stood the royal standard, a great banner depicting a raven with wings spread wide, the symbol of Odin's favor and a sign to all who saw it that this was no ordinary warband, but the personal army of a king who claimed descent from the gods themselves. But even as Hardrada's army prepared for battle, events were unfolding elsewhere that would ultimately determine the outcome of the day. Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned King of England, had received word of the Viking landing from his spies in the north, and had immediately begun marshalling his forces for a response that would demonstrate the resolve of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom to defend its borders against all invaders. The army that Harold assembled was different from anything that previous Viking invaders had faced, a force that combined the traditional Anglo-Saxon militia with new tactical innovations that had been developed in response to the changing nature of medieval warfare. The core of the army consisted of professional soldiers known as housecarls, warriors who were paid and equipped by the king and who had made warfare their full-time occupation. These men carried the great Danish axes that had become the signature weapon of Anglo-Saxon infantry, two-handed weapons capable of cleaving through mail and helm with devastating effect. The march of Harold's army from London to Yorkshire was one of the most remarkable military movements of the medieval period, covering more than 200 miles in less than 5 days. Despite the primitive state of English roads and the difficulty of moving large numbers of men and equipment across country, the king drove his forces at a pace that left many stragglers behind, understanding that speed was essential if he hoped to catch the Vikings before they could consolidate their position and establish the kind of fortified base that had made earlier invasions so difficult to dislodge. The Vikings at Stamford Bridge were caught completely off guard by the speed of Harold's advance. Many of their best warriors were still at their ships, more than 10 miles away, having left their armor behind in the unseasonably warm weather. The first indication that anything was wrong came when scouts reported the approach of a large army from the south. But by then it was too late to organize an effective defense or retreat to a more favorable position. The battle began with a series of individual combats on the narrow bridge that gave the engagement its name, a structure barely wide enough for 2 men to fight abreast and therefore capable of being held by a small number of determined defenders. According to legend, a single Viking warrior armed with a great axe held the bridge against the entire English army for more than an hour, cutting down dozens of attackers before finally being killed when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the gaps between the planks. Once the bridge was finally taken, the battle became a general engagement between 2 of the finest armies of the age, a contest that would determine not only the immediate fate of England, but the future direction of European civilization. The Vikings, despite being caught at a disadvantage, fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that defeat would mean not just death, but the end of their way of life. Harold Hardrada positioned himself at the center of the Viking line, where his towering figure and gleaming armor made him a focal point for both his own warriors and the enemy forces arrayed against him. He fought with the skill and ferocity that had made him legendary throughout the warrior world, his great sword carving a path of destruction through the English ranks as he sought to reach Harold Godwinson in personal combat. But the English army that faced the Vikings at Stamford Bridge was not the same force that had been defeated by earlier Scandinavian invaders. These were disciplined professional soldiers who had been trained to work together as a unit rather than relying purely on individual prowess. Their tactics emphasized coordination and mutual support, with archers providing covering fire while infantry advanced in carefully ordered formations, designed to maximize their collective effectiveness. The turning point in the battle came when an English arrow found its mark in Harold Hardrada's throat, felling the giant king in the midst of his charge toward the enemy line. The sight of their leader falling was a devastating blow to Viking morale. But rather than breaking immediately, the Northmen rallied around the body of their fallen king and continued to fight with the kind of suicidal bravery that had made them feared throughout Europe. The final phase of the battle was a massacre, as the English forces systematically destroyed what remained of the Viking army. Those Northmen who tried to flee found their escape routes blocked by English cavalry, while those who stood and fought were gradually overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactics. By the time the sun set on that September evening, the cream of Scandinavian warrior nobility lay dead on the field, their dreams of conquest buried beneath the Yorkshire soil. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge marked the end of an era that had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier with the raid on Lindisfarne. The survivors of Hardrada's army, reduced from several thousand to barely 24 ship limped back to Norway, bearing news of a defeat so complete that it effectively ended the Viking threat to Western Europe. Never again would the dragon ships appear in such numbers off the coasts of England or France. Never again would the northern kingdoms possess the resources or the will to mount the kind of massive expeditions that had terrorized Europe for so long. But even as the immediate Viking threat receded, the cultural and political changes that the Northmen had wrought during their centuries of raiding and conquest continued to shape the development of medieval Europe. The kingdoms they had established in England, Ireland, France, and Russia would persist for centuries, while the trading networks they had created continued to connect distant regions of the world in ways that would have been impossible without their maritime expertise and commercial acumen. The sound of clashing steel had finally fallen silent across the battlefields of Europe, but the echoes of Viking conquest would resonate through history for centuries to come. As the survivors of Stamford Bridge sailed home through the grey waters of the North Sea, they carried with them not just the bitter taste of defeat, but the end of an age that had transformed the medieval world in ways that contemporaries could barely comprehend. The immediate aftermath of the Viking Age left a continent profoundly changed by 3 centuries of Nordic influence. Entire regions of Europe bore the indelible marks of Scandinavian settlement, from the Danelaw of England to the Duchy of Normandy in France, from the Kingdom of Dublin in Ireland to the Principality of Kiev in Russia. These were not merely conquered territories that had been briefly occupied by foreign invaders, but new hybrid societies that combined Viking and local traditions into something entirely unprecedented in European history. In England, the integration of Viking settlers into Anglo-Saxon society had created a cultural synthesis that would ultimately prove more durable than either of its component parts. The Danelaw had introduced Scandinavian concepts of law and governance that emphasized individual rights and democratic participation in ways that were foreign to the more hierarchical traditions of Anglo-Saxon England. Viking assemblies, known as things, had given common farmers and craftsmen a voice in local government that would persist long after the military threat from Scandinavia had receded. The linguistic impact of Viking settlement was equally profound and enduring. The English language that emerged from the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse was fundamentally different from its Germanic origins. Simplified in grammar but enriched with thousands of new words that reflected the practical concerns of a society, shaped by constant interaction between different cultural groups. Common English words like husband, skill, anger, ugly, wrong, and die all derive from Old Norse, indicating the depth to which Viking culture had penetrated into the daily life of medieval England. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, the Vikings had introduced new concepts of exploration and trade that would ultimately reshape the entire European worldview. The maritime technology that had carried Viking raiders to the shores of North America 5 centuries before Columbus would inspire later generations of European explorers, while the trading networks that connected Scandinavia to Constantinople and the Far East provided the foundation for the commercial revolution that would transform medieval Europe into the modern world system. The political impact of Viking expansion was equally significant, though often overlooked by historians who focus primarily on the military aspects of the Nordic conquests. The establishment of Viking kingdoms and principalities had introduced new forms of governance that combined Scandinavian traditions with local practices in ways that often proved more flexible and adaptable than purely indigenous institutions. The Viking emphasis on personal loyalty and contractual relationships, rather than the rigid feudal hierarchies that characterized much of medieval Europe, would eventually contribute to the development of more democratic forms of government. Perhaps nowhere was this political influence more significant than in the development of maritime law and commercial practices. Viking merchants had created the first truly international trading system in medieval Europe, establishing standardized weights and measures, reliable currencies, and legal frameworks for resolving commercial disputes that would serve as the foundation for later European expansion into global markets. The Hanseatic leagues that dominated Baltic and North sea trade for centuries were direct descendants of Viking commercial networks, while many of the legal principles that governed medieval trade can be traced back to Scandinavian precedents. The military legacy of the Vikings was equally profound, though it manifested itself in ways that went far beyond their reputation for ferocity in battle. The tactical innovations that had made Viking warriors so effective, from their emphasis on mobility and surprise to their integration of sea and land operations, would be studied and imitated by military commanders for centuries. The Norman conquest of England, which occurred just weeks after the Viking defeat at Stamford Bridge, employed many of the same techniques that had made earlier Scandinavian invasions so successful. But perhaps the most important military contribution of the Vikings was their demonstration that small, highly motivated forces could achieve strategic objectives far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The concept of elite units operating independently behind enemy lines, the use of psychological warfare to break enemy morale, and the importance of intelligence gathering and careful planning. All of these became standard elements of European military thinking, largely because of lessons learned from Viking campaigns. The technological innovations that had given Vikings their initial advantages in warfare and exploration would continue to influence European development long after the military threat from Scandinavia had disappeared. Viking shipbuilding techniques, refined through centuries of navigating some of the world's most dangerous waters, provided the foundation for the vessels that would carry European explorers to the Americas and around the African coast to Asia. The navigational methods that had allowed Viking sailors to cross vast expanses of open ocean with remarkable accuracy would be enhanced and systematized by later generations of European navigators. Even more significantly, the Viking tradition of technological innovation and adaptation would become a defining characteristic of Northern European culture. The willingness to experiment with new techniques, to adapt foreign innovations to local conditions, and to pursue practical solutions to complex problems. All of these traits that had made Vikings such successful raiders and conquerors would eventually contribute to the scientific and industrial revolutions that would transform the modern world. The religious impact of the Viking Age was equally complex and far-reaching, though it is often oversimplified in popular accounts that focus primarily on the conflict between pagan and Christian worldviews. While it is certainly true that Viking raids caused enormous damage to Christian monasteries and churches, the long-term effect of Nordic expansion was actually to accelerate the Christianization of Northern Europe and to create new syntheses between pagan and Christian traditions. The conversion of Viking kingdoms to Christianity was not simply a matter of political expediency, but reflected genuine changes in Scandinavian culture that had been developing throughout the Viking Age. The warrior culture that had initially seemed so antithetical to Christian values was gradually transformed by contact with Christian societies, while Christian theology itself was influenced by Nordic concepts of honor, loyalty, and heroic death that would find expression in medieval ideas about crusading and chivalry. The economic transformation of Europe during the Viking Age was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Scandinavian expansion, though it is also the aspect of Viking influence that is least understood by modern observers. The wealth that flowed into Scandinavia from raiding and trading activities was not simply hoarded by Viking chieftains, but was reinvested in ways that stimulated economic development throughout Northern Europe. The silver that Vikings extracted from their victims through tribute payments and ransom demands found its way into European markets, where it helped to monetize economies that had previously relied primarily on barter systems. More importantly, the international trading networks that Vikings connected previously isolated regions of Europe to global markets in ways that would have profound long-term consequences. Irish monks found themselves in contact with merchants from Novgorod, while Frankish craftsmen could sell their products to buyers in Constantinople. This increased connectivity not only stimulated economic growth, but also facilitated the exchange of ideas and technologies that would accelerate the pace of European development. The urban development that occurred in regions settled by Vikings was particularly significant. As Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen established towns and cities that became major centers of international commerce. Dublin, York, Kiev, and Novgorod all began as Viking trading posts and evolved into major commercial and political centers that would shape the development of their respective regions for centuries to come. The urban planning techniques, commercial practices, and craft traditions established in these Viking towns provided models that would be copied throughout medieval Europe. The demographic impact of Viking expansion was equally significant, though much more difficult to quantify. The movement of large numbers of people from Scandinavia to other parts of Europe and beyond represented one of the largest population transfers of the medieval period, comparable in scale to the barbarian migrations that had ended the Roman Empire. This population movement had profound genetic and cultural consequences that can still be traced in modern European populations. But the Vikings were not simply conquerors who imposed their culture on subject peoples. Instead, they proved remarkably adept at cultural adaptation, adopting local customs and practices while retaining distinctive elements of their Scandinavian heritage. This cultural flexibility allowed Viking settlers to integrate successfully into very different societies, from the Celtic kingdoms of Ireland and Scotland to the Slavic principalities of Eastern Europe. The intellectual and artistic legacy of the Vikings was equally significant, though it is often overshadowed by their military reputation. The oral traditions that preserved the history and mythology of Scandinavian peoples would eventually be written down in the form of sagas and eddas that represent some of the finest literary achievements of medieval Europe. These works not only provide invaluable historical information about the Viking Age, but also demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social relationships that would influence European literature for centuries. The artistic traditions that developed in Viking settlements combined Scandinavian, decorative motifs with local influences to create distinctive new styles that can be seen in everything from stone carvings to metal. The intricate interlace patterns that decorated Viking weapons and jewelry would influence European art throughout the medieval period, while the representational techniques developed by Scandinavian artists would contribute to the development of medieval sculpture and painting. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings had demonstrated that the boundaries between civilizations were far more permeable than previous generations had imagined. Their success in adapting to different environments and cultures, while retaining their essential identity, provided a model for cultural exchange that would become increasingly important as European societies became more interconnected. As we look back across the centuries that have passed since the last Viking longship disappeared over the northern horizon, we can see that their influence extends far beyond the immediate destruction and conquest that dominated contemporary accounts. The Vikings had not simply raided and pillaged their way across Europe, but had fundamentally altered the trajectory of European civilization in ways that continue to shape our world today. The democratic traditions that characterize modern Scandinavian societies can trace their origins back to the Thing assemblies that governed Viking communities. The commercial practices that dominate modern international trade bear the unmistakable influence of Viking innovations in banking, insurance, and contract law. Even the modern concept of exploration and adventure, the idea that individuals can venture into unknown territories and create new possibilities for themselves and their societies, owes much to the Viking example. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vikings is their demonstration that small groups of determined individuals, properly organized and motivated, can achieve objectives that seem far beyond their apparent capabilities. This lesson has been learned and relearned by countless generations since the Viking Age ended. From the conquistadors who conquered the Americas to the entrepreneurs who built the modern global economy. In the end, the Vikings succeeded not because they were more savage or ruthless than their enemies, though they certainly could be both, but because they were more adaptable, more innovative, and more willing to take risks than the societies they encountered. They represented a perfect fusion of practical intelligence and warrior courage that made them nearly unstoppable when they chose to focus their energies on a particular objective. The terror they inspired was real enough, and the destruction they caused was often devastating to their immediate victims. But their ultimate contribution to human civilization was not destruction, but creation. The creation of new possibilities for human achievement that expanded the horizons of what seemed possible for determined individuals willing to venture beyond the boundaries of their known world. As the last echoes of their war songs fade into the mists of history, we are left with the enduring example of what can be accomplished when human intelligence, courage, and determination are combined with the willingness to embrace change and adaptation as the price of survival and success. In this sense, the Vikings never truly disappeared, but live on in the spirit of exploration and adventure that continues to drive human achievement to this day. The savage battles of the Viking raiders had ended, but their legacy would endure as long as there were men and women willing to venture into unknown waters in search of new opportunities and greater glory. The dragon ships had vanished, but the courage and determination that had carried them to the edges of the known world would continue to inspire new generations of adventurers, explorers, and conquerors who would carry the human story into realms that even the Vikings could never have imagined.